The Valkyrie Institute of Higher Mathematics stood at the peak of Mount Suresh, its crystalline spires reaching toward the purple sky of Valkar Prime. For 300 standard years, the greatest minds of the Valkyrie species had gathered within its walls, dedicated to a single purpose: solving the infinite convergence problem. The problem had first appeared in the ancient texts of the predecessor civilization, a race that had vanished from the galaxy tens of thousands of years ago. The equation itself was deceptively simple in appearance, a mere 12 symbols arranged in a configuration that seemed almost playful. Yet every attempt to solve it led to contradictions, infinities that spiraled out of control, or results that violated the fundamental laws of mathematics itself. The current high mathematician, an elderly Valkyrie named Thesson, had devoted her entire adult life to the problem. Her scales had faded from the vibrant blue of youth to a pale silver, and her once sharp claws had dulled with age. She stood now in the grand chamber, where the equation was displayed in holographic glory, each symbol glowing with soft amber light. Around her, dozens of mathematicians worked at their stations, their six-fingered hands moving across calculation devices, their twin pairs of eyes fixed on screens filled with numbers and symbols. The Valkyrie were known throughout the galaxy as the masters of mathematical thought. Their language was built on numerical concepts, their art was expressed in geometric patterns, and their very society was structured according to algorithmic principles. Every Valkyrie child learned advanced calculus before they could properly speak, and their greatest heroes were not warriors or explorers, but those who had proven new theorems or discovered elegant solutions to ancient problems. The infinite convergence problem represented the ultimate challenge, a puzzle that had humbled generation after generation of their finest minds. Tayson moved slowly through the chamber, her walking staff tapping softly against the polished stone floor. She paused at the station of young Karis, whose scales still shone with the deep blue of someone barely past their first century. Karis had been at the Institute for 20 years now, and his approach to the problem involved breaking it down into 17,000 smaller equations, each of which could theoretically be solved independently before being recombined into a final solution. He had so far managed to solve 14,312 of these sub-equations, a remarkable achievement that had earned him considerable respect among his peers. "Any progress?" Tayson asked, though she already knew the answer. She asked the same question every day, and every day the answer was the same. "The integration pathway continues to elude me," Karis replied, not looking up from his work. "I have discovered 7 new boundary conditions that must be satisfied simultaneously, which reduces the solution space by approximately 43%. However, this also introduces a recursive dependency that may require restructuring the entire framework." Tayson nodded. This was typical. Every breakthrough revealed new complications. Every solution spawned new problems. The infinite convergence problem was like a living thing, adapting and evolving to resist all attempts at resolution. Some of the more philosophical mathematicians had begun to suggest that perhaps the equation was not meant to be solved at all, that it represented some fundamental limit of mathematical knowledge. Tayson rejected such defeatist thinking, but she understood the temptation. After 3 centuries of collective effort, the Institute had made virtually no meaningful progress. She continued her rounds, stopping briefly to consult with other mathematicians. Venn and his team were pursuing an approach based on trans-dimensional analysis, attempting to solve the equation in a hypothetical 9-dimensional space before projecting the results back into normal 4-dimensional space-time. Olara had devoted herself to historical research, studying every known instance where the predecessors had referenced the equation, looking for clues in the context in commentary. Thresh worked alone in a corner, his station surrounded by old-fashioned paper calculations, convinced that there was something about the tactile nature of physical writing that would reveal insights that digital computation could not. The institute received funding from the Valkyrie government and private patrons across the galaxy. The solution to the infinite convergence problem was believed to have profound implications for understanding the nature of reality itself. Some theorized it would unlock new forms of faster-than-light travel. Others believed it held the key to unlimited energy generation. Still others thought it might explain the mysterious disappearance of the predecessors themselves. The truth was that nobody really knew what solving it would accomplish, but the Valkyrie were a people driven by the pure pursuit of knowledge. The problem existed, and therefore it must be solved. That was reason enough. As evening fell and the purple sky deepened to violet, Thesson retreated to her private office. The room was spare and simple, containing only her desk, a few chairs, and walls lined with data crystals containing centuries of work on the problem. She settled into her chair and pulled up her own calculations, the ones she worked on in private, away from the eyes of her colleagues. Her approach was different from all the others. She believed the equation had to be understood not as a mathematical construct, but as a philosophical statement. The predecessors had been trying to express something fundamental about the universe, and the mathematics was merely the language they had chosen. If she could understand what they had been trying to say, the solution would follow naturally. But after 70 years of pursuing this approach, she was no closer than when she had started. The symbols mocked her from the screen, their meanings as opaque as ever. She worked until exhaustion claimed her, then retired to her sleeping quarters, knowing that tomorrow would bring the same struggles, the same questions, the same lack of answers. The news reached the Institute 6 months later, arriving via the Galactic Information Network that connected all civilized worlds. Humanity had been discovered. A new species, previously unknown to the greater galactic community, had developed faster-than-light travel independently and had made contact with a Thrin exploration vessel near the outer edge of the Orion Arm. The discovery caused tremendous excitement across the galaxy. New species were rare, and humanity apparently brought with them unique perspectives and technologies that had developed in complete isolation from the rest of galactic civilization. The Valkyrie government immediately extended an invitation for cultural and scientific exchange. Humanity accepted, and within a year the first human diplomats and scholars began arriving on Valkyr Prime. Thesson paid little attention to these developments. She was happy that her people were making new friends, but she had more important concerns. The infinite convergence problem would not solve itself, and every day she grew older, her time running shorter. It was Karis who first suggested inviting a human mathematician to the Institute. The young Valkyrie had attended a lecture by a human named Dr. Sarah Chen, who had presented some fascinating work on what humans called chaos theory and strange attractors. While the mathematics was relatively primitive by Valkyrie standards, the conceptual framework was intriguing. Humans seemed to have a different way of thinking about mathematical problems, one that emphasized pattern recognition and intuitive leaps rather than the rigorous, step-by-step logical progression that the Valkyrie favored. Thesson was skeptical. Humanity was barely past the stage of primitive space travel. Their mathematical understanding, while impressive for such a young species, was thousands of years behind that of the Valkyrie. What could they possibly contribute to a problem that had stumped the galaxy's greatest mathematical minds for 3 centuries? But Karis was insistent, and other younger mathematicians began to echo his suggestion. Finally, more to satisfy them than out of any real hope, Thesson agreed to extend an invitation. The human who accepted was not a famous professor or a renowned genius. Her name was Riley Torres, and she was, by human standards, quite ordinary. She held a doctorate in applied mathematics from a university on Earth, and had spent most of her career teaching undergraduate students and doing contract work for various human corporations. She was curious about alien mathematics and excited by the opportunity to visit another world. But she had no illusions about making some grand contribution to Valkyrie science. She simply wanted to learn and experience something new. Riley arrived at the Institute on a crisp autumn morning, when the leaves of the native Valkyrie trees had turned a deep crimson and the air smelled of approaching winter. She was nervous as she climbed the long stairway to the entrance, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. The building itself was intimidating, all sharp angles and towering crystal, making her feel very small and very far from home. A young Valkyrie named Karis met her at the entrance, his scales gleaming in the morning light. He was kind and welcoming, his 4 eyes showing genuine curiosity about her presence. He explained that he would be her guide and translator, though Riley's language implant did most of the actual translation work. The Valkyrie language was mathematical in nature, with each word carrying numerical associations and quantitative meanings that were difficult for non-Valkyrie to fully grasp. Karis led her through the institute, pointing out various chambers and facilities. Riley was amazed by the scale of the operation. Hundreds of Valkyrie mathematicians worked here, all dedicated to pure research, free from the commercial pressures and funding concerns that plagued academic institutions back on Earth. She saw computation chambers filled with quantum processors more advanced than anything humans had yet developed. She visited libraries containing mathematical texts from dozens of species, accumulated over thousands of years. The wealth of knowledge housed in this single building exceeded that of every mathematical institution on Earth combined. Finally, Karis brought her to the grand chamber and showed her the infinite convergence problem. The equation hung in the air before them, glowing softly. Riley stared at it for a long moment, tilting her head slightly as she studied the symbols. Karis explained the history of the problem, the centuries of effort, the thousands of approaches that had been tried and failed. He described some of the current research directions, the various theoretical frameworks being employed. His voice carried a mixture of pride and frustration, the emotional complexity of someone who had devoted their life to an impossible task. Riley listened politely, but her attention kept returning to the equation itself. There was something familiar about it, though she could not quite place what. The symbols were alien, of course, but the structure of the equation reminded her of something she had seen before, back in graduate school perhaps, or in one of the many textbooks she had studied over the years. She pulled out her portable datapad and asked Karis if he could translate the equation into human mathematical notation. He did so, his fingers moving quickly across his own device, and a moment later Riley's screen displayed the equation in familiar symbols. She stared at it. Then she stared some more. A strange feeling came over her, a mixture of excitement and disbelief. "Can I see the work that's been done on this?" she asked. Karis seemed pleased by her interest. He transferred several files to her datapad, explaining that these represented the major approaches that had been pursued over the past century. Riley thanked him and asked if there was somewhere quiet she could sit and study the material. Karis led her to a small alcove with a desk and chair, telling her she could take all the time she needed. Riley sat down and began to read. The Valkyrie work was impressive in its thoroughness and rigor. Every logical step was justified, every assumption was explicitly stated, every calculation was checked and double-checked. But as she read, a growing sense of confusion filled her. The Valkyrie were approaching the problem in an incredibly complicated way, breaking it down into thousands of pieces, constructing elaborate theoretical frameworks, invoking advanced mathematical concepts that Riley only barely understood. Yet the equation itself, when she looked at it in human notation, seemed almost simple. Not simple to solve, certainly, but simple in structure. It had an elegant quality to it, a kind of mathematical beauty that suggested there should be an elegant solution to match. She pulled out a napkin from her jacket pocket. It was left over from breakfast at the human embassy, a soft paper square with the embassy logo printed in one corner. She clicked her pen and began to write, transcribing the equation at the top of the napkin. Then she stared at it, letting her mind wander, not forcing anything, just observing. This was how she had always approached difficult problems, not by attacking them directly, but by letting them percolate in her subconscious, waiting for an intuitive insight to emerge. And then she saw it. The trick was so simple she almost laughed out loud. The Valkyrie had been treating the equation as a problem of infinite series and complex integration, because that was the obvious approach, the rigorous mathematical way to handle expressions of this type. But there was another way to look at it, a way that involved recognizing a pattern rather than grinding through calculations. If you rotated the equation conceptually, treating certain terms as if they belonged to a different domain, and then applied a substitution that was normally used in a completely different context, the infinite series collapsed into a finite expression. From there, it was just basic algebra. Riley worked quickly, her pen scratching across the napkin. She filled one side, flipped it over, and continued on the back. The calculations were simple, the kind of things she made her undergraduate students do as homework exercises. Substitution, simplification, rearrangement. In less than 15 minutes, she had arrived at a final answer, a clean, elegant solution expressed in just 3 terms. She double-checked her work, looking for errors, but found none. The solution satisfied all the conditions of the original equation. It was correct. She sat back, staring at the napkin in her hands, not quite believing what she had just done. This was the problem that had stumped the Valkyrie for 300 years? This was the great challenge that dozens of their finest minds could not solve? She felt a surge of doubt. Surely she must have made a mistake. It could not possibly be this simple. Yet as she reviewed her work again, she could find no flaw in the logic. The mathematics was sound. Riley stood up and walked back to the grand chamber, the napkin clutched in her hand. Karras was at his station, working on his 14,000 sub-equations. She approached him hesitantly, not wanting to interrupt. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I think I might have found something." Karras looked up, his 4 eyes focusing on her with polite interest. "Already? You have been here barely an hour. Have you thought of a new approach to investigate? We are always interested in fresh perspectives." "Not exactly," Riley said. "I think I might have actually solved it. The equation, I mean. The infinite convergence problem." She held out the napkin. "Could you check this for me? I want to make sure I did not make any silly mistakes." Karras stared at her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then his eyes moved to the napkin. He took it from her hands gently, as if it might disintegrate at any moment. His eyes scanned the writing, moving rapidly across Riley's handwritten calculations. His scales began to shift in color, darkening slightly, a sign of intense emotion that Riley had learned indicated either great stress or great excitement. He stood abruptly, almost knocking over his chair. "Wait here," he said, his voice tight. "Do not move." He hurried across the chamber toward Theson's office, the napkin held carefully in his hands. Riley stood awkwardly in the middle of the grand chamber, suddenly aware that other Valkyrie mathematicians were looking at her with curiosity. She smiled weakly and gave a small wave, then immediately felt foolish for doing so. A few minutes passed, though it felt much longer. Then Karras emerged from Theson's office, followed by the high mathematician herself. Theson was walking more quickly than Riley would have thought possible for someone of her age, her walking staff tapping a rapid rhythm against the floor. Behind her came a stream of other senior mathematicians, all converging on Riley's position. Theson approached Riley directly, her 4 eyes fixed on the human with an intensity that was almost frightening. "You wrote this?" she asked, holding up the napkin. "These calculations are yours?" "Yes," Riley said, her voice small. I think so. I might have made a mistake. I just saw a pattern and followed it, and this is what came out." Theson turned to the assembled mathematicians. "Verify it," she ordered. "Run it through every test. Check every step. I want confirmation within the hour." The mathematicians scattered to their stations, hands moving frantically across their devices. The grand chamber, which had been relatively quiet when Riley first arrived, now buzzed with urgent activity. Thesson looked back at Riley. "Explain your reasoning," she said. "How did you arrive at this approach?" Riley tried to put it into words, describing the pattern she had recognized, the conceptual rotation she had performed, the substitution that had collapsed the infinite series. As she spoke, she could see confusion on Thesson's face, and on the faces of the other Valkyrie who had gathered to listen. "But why would you rotate it in that manner?" one of them asked. "There is no logical basis for such a transformation." "It just seemed right," Riley said helplessly. "I cannot really explain it better than that. It was intuitive." The word intuitive clearly meant something different to the Valkyrie than it did to humans. They exchanged glances, their scales rippling with colors that Riley had not seen before. Before anyone could ask more questions, one of the mathematicians at a nearby station called out, "The first verification is complete. The solution is mathematically sound. All boundary conditions are satisfied." Another voice joined in. "Second verification confirms. The result is valid." One by one, the mathematicians reported their findings. Every check came back positive. The solution that Riley had scribbled on a napkin in 15 minutes was correct. The infinite convergence problem, the challenge that had defined the Valkyrie Institute for 3 centuries, had been solved by a human who barely understood what she had done. Thesson was silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was very soft. 300 years, she said. 15 generations of our finest minds. And a human solves it in less time than it takes to brew a pot of tea. She did not sound angry, merely stunned, as if the universe had revealed itself to operate by rules she had not previously understood. She looked at Riley with something that might have been respect, or might have been fear. "How is this possible?" Riley did not have a good answer. She tried to explain how humans approach mathematical problems, how they often relied on pattern recognition and intuitive leaps rather than pure logical progression. She described how human mathematicians often saw solutions before they could formally prove them, how they trusted their instincts and followed hunches. To the Valkyrie, this sounded like madness. Mathematics was the science of absolute certainty, of rigorous proof and logical inevitability. The idea that one could arrive at correct answers through vague feelings and unquantifiable intuition was contrary to everything they understood about how knowledge worked. Yet the proof was there, written on a napkin in Riley's neat handwriting. The calculations were simple enough that any undergraduate student could follow them. The logic was clear and correct. The Valkyrie had simply never thought to approach the problem in that particular way because it did not fit their framework for how mathematical reasoning should proceed. They had been searching for a complex solution because the problem seemed complex, never considering that complexity and difficulty were not the same thing. They had been so busy constructing elaborate theoretical frameworks that they had missed the simple pattern hiding in plain sight. Word spread quickly through the Institute, and from there to the wider Valkyrie mathematical community, and then to the entire galaxy. The human who solved the infinite convergence problem became an instant celebrity, though Riley herself was uncomfortable with the attention. She had not set out to embarrass the Valkyrie or to prove human superiority. She had simply looked at an interesting problem and followed where her intuition led. That it had succeeded where centuries of alien effort had failed was more a matter of luck and different perspective than any innate superiority of human cognition. But the galaxy at large did not see it that way. Humanity, the newcomers, the primitives who had barely left their own solar system, had accomplished what the most advanced mathematical minds could not. The implications were staggering. If humans could solve problems that other species found impossible, what other capabilities might they possess? What other unique qualities might they bring to galactic civilization? The discovery sparked a wave of interest in human cognitive patterns, human psychology, human education methods. Universities across dozens of worlds began offering courses in human-style intuitive reasoning, trying to understand and replicate whatever it was that allowed humans to make these conceptual leaps. The Valkyrie themselves had a more complex reaction. On one level, they were grateful. The infinite convergence problem had been solved, and the solution opened up new avenues of research and understanding, just as predicted. The equation, once solved, revealed deep truths about the nature of dimensional folding and energy distribution in complex systems. It would take decades to fully explore all the implications, but preliminary analysis suggested revolutionary applications in fields ranging from power generation to faster-than-light travel. The Valkyrie had their answer, and it had come from an unexpected source. But on another level, the ease with which Riley had solved it was deeply troubling. It called into question the very foundations of Valkyrie mathematical philosophy. If rigorous logical progression was not the only path to truth, if intuition and pattern recognition could lead to correct answers, what did that mean for their entire way of understanding the world? Some Valkyrie rejected the idea entirely, insisting that Riley's solution was merely a lucky guess, a random stab in the dark that happened to work. Others argued that the solution must have been hidden somewhere in human mathematical literature, that Riley had unconsciously remembered something she had seen before. Still others took it as a profound philosophical lesson, evidence that different species might have different but equally valid ways of understanding reality. Thesson herself struggled with the implications. She had devoted 70 years to the problem, approaching it from every logical angle, constructing elaborate theoretical frameworks, building mathematical machinery of tremendous sophistication and beauty, and all of it had been unnecessary. A human had looked at the equation for 15 minutes and seen what Thesson, for all her expertise and experience, had been unable to perceive. It was humbling in a way that was almost unbearable. Yet as she studied Riley's solution, working through the simple steps, she could not deny its elegance. It was beautiful in its simplicity, and there was a kind of poetry to it that her own approaches had lacked. Perhaps that was the real lesson. Mathematics was not only about rigor and logic, it was also about beauty and elegance, and the recognition of patterns that existed beyond formal proof. Riley stayed at the Institute for another 3 months, working with Karras and the other mathematicians, trying to explain her thought process and teach them her approach to problem solving. It was difficult. The Valkyrie struggled with the idea of trusting intuition, of making leaps without solid logical foundations. Their minds simply did not work that way. But slowly, some of them began to understand. They learned to step back from pure calculation and look at problems from different angles. They practiced recognizing patterns and making connections between seemingly unrelated concepts. They would never think exactly like humans, but they could learn to incorporate some human-style reasoning into their own approaches. The result was a kind of hybrid methodology that combined Valkyrie rigor with human intuition, and it proved remarkably effective at solving problems that had previously seemed intractable. When Riley finally returned to Earth, she was a changed person. The experience had given her a new appreciation for her own abilities, a recognition that her way of thinking, which had always seemed so ordinary and unremarkable, was actually quite special. She returned to her teaching position at the university, but with a new confidence and enthusiasm. Her students noticed the difference. She began to emphasize intuition and pattern recognition more in her courses, encouraging students to trust their instincts and make creative leaps. She told them the story of the napkin, though she downplayed her own role and emphasized the importance of different perspectives and approaches. The story became famous among human mathematicians, and napkin proofs became a badge of honor, a symbol of elegant simplicity triumphing over unnecessary complexity. For the Valkyrie, the incident marked a turning point in their civilization. The realization that other species might have different, but equally valid ways of understanding reality led to a broader opening up of their culture. They began to collaborate more with other species, not just sharing knowledge, but actively seeking out different perspectives and approaches. The Institute itself changed significantly. Where once it had been a place of pure Valkyrie mathematics, it became a true galactic institution, hosting scholars from dozens of species, each bringing their own unique cognitive styles and problem-solving methods. The cross-pollination of ideas led to an explosion of new discoveries and insights. Problems that had seemed impossible for centuries were solved through the combination of different species' approaches. The Valkyrie contributed their rigor and logical precision. Humans brought their intuition and pattern recognition. The Thryn added their gift for spatial reasoning. The Meklar provided their computational thinking. Together, they accomplished far more than any single species could have alone. Thesson lived long enough to see this transformation of the institute she had led for so long. In her final years, she often reflected on that autumn morning when a nervous human had climbed the stairs to the institute's entrance, carrying in her mind the solution to a 300-year-old problem. It had seemed like a disaster at the time, a humiliating demonstration of Valkyrie limitations. But with the perspective of time, Thesson came to see it differently. It was not a failure of the Valkyrie, it was simply evidence that the universe was larger and stranger than any one species could fully comprehend. No matter how advanced you were, no matter how much you knew, there was always more to learn, always new ways of seeing and understanding. That realization, more than the solution itself, was the real gift that Riley had given them. The napkin itself was preserved and placed in a special display case in the Grand Chamber, alongside the holographic representation of the infinite convergence problem. Visitors to the Institute would stop and stare at it, amazed that such a simple piece of paper could represent such a profound moment in galactic history. The writing was fading now, the ink slowly degrading despite the best preservation efforts. But the message remained clear. Sometimes the most elegant solutions are also the simplest. Sometimes the answer you are looking for requires not more knowledge, but a different way of looking. And sometimes the greatest wisdom comes from the most unexpected sources. The napkin served as a reminder of all these truths. A small piece of paper that had changed the galaxy forever. Proof that humanity, for all their youth and inexperience, had something unique and valuable to contribute to the grand tapestry of galactic civilization.